the global catalog, universal group membership caching, and printer location policies. In this nugget, we'll be taking a look at the global catalog, universal group membership caching, and printer location. The global catalog servers are going to be a critical part of the exam objective that reads placement of servers and site and replication topology under the Design Active Directory Physical Topology exam objective. So that's all related when it comes to the global catalog servers. You have to know best places to put them, places where if you do put them, it could cause a problem, normally with slow WAN links and the like. And then if you do have problems with the slow WAN link, you can use universal group membership caching, which also meets the same exam objectives that I just mentioned. This is going to be a way that we can cache the group membership in terms of universal groups for our users that log on, so that we don't have to always depend on a global catalog server and also have to depend on the replication that comes along with it. Then there's the printer location policy. This is a great way to make sure that your users can easily find printers that are actually near them in their closest subnet. Alright, in our last nugget, we talked about replicating across IP site links, and 99.9% of the time, that's what you're going to want to use. It's the most reliable, it's going to give you the best performance, and it's able to replicate everything that you need across that site link, whereas another kind that I'll show you shortly leaves some things out, unfortunately. Well, the IP site link, however, does depend upon a reliable, always-up a WAN connection. If you have very, very slow and very, very unreliable WAN links, you may not be able to use an IP site link, because IP requires almost instant gratification in terms of getting confirmation packets or acknowledgement packets back that various parts of the data are being transmitted properly. And if it's slow or unreliable, or if it's getting a lot of latency in the connection, you may get a lot of failures in this WAN link traffic when it tries to do its replication. That can cause you a lot of troubleshooting scenarios that you might not really want. So if that's the case, let's take a look at something else that could possibly be the case here. And in this diagram, what I've got here is I'm going to go to using an SMTP connection instead, an SMTP site link. Here I've got my Phoenix site. Here I've got my Tucson site. Unfortunately, for some reason or another, we're only able to get a really, really slow and unreliable WAN link here. Only it's a 128K link. And we have some problems with it. Our ISP is not reliable, or for whatever reason, we're having issues with it. So we tried using IP, but it constantly timed out. We wound up with situations in which we had incomplete data down here, or replication troubleshooting problems, and so what we realized we had to do is to use SMTP instead. Now, some of you are already well versed with SMTP, maybe you work with Exchange a lot, and you happen to know that SMTP stands for Simple Mail Transport Protocol. And you're thinking, James, what do? Are we sending email attachments with all of the replication data in it? No, that's not the point of this. The reason why we use an email protocol for this is because it's a lot more reliable in terms of using slow or unreliable transmissions. It doesn't have to get that instant gratification that IP has to get, and so because of the nature of this protocol, it's able to handle these really rough WAN links a little bit better. Now we have some other problems though. It's not always as good as it sounds. We're going to have to make some trade-offs here. Yeah, we can now get replication to take place. Only problem is we can't replicate the same domain. I can't have Nuggelab here and Nuggelab down here over SMTP, because it will not replicate the domain naming context. And in fact, in order to be more specific here, the SMTP link is unable to transmit the domain directory partitions. That's why we can't have the same domain here as we do down here, because an SMTP link will only be able to communicate the configuration, schema, and application directory partitions. Okay, so this really leaves you in a bind. It's a very serious compromise that you're going to have to make, because, boy, it's a huge pain to set up an entirely different domain only because your ISP won't get their act together and give you a better connection here. In fact, my suggestion is that instead of going with SMTP, you instead go with SSTP, okay, which is the Smoke Signal Transport Protocol. You'd be better off using smoke signals to transmit this instead. Of course, I'm only joking there. All right, another thing you'd have to keep in mind with this is, since it's not going to be able to use Kerberos over SMTP, then it's not going to be able to authenticate it properly or provide any data encryption as it normally would with RPC over IP. So, now what you have to do is you got to set up a certificate authority as well. Now I have to buy a server, I have to install, a certificate authority here, I have to come up with a whole PKI plan to be able to properly protect this data using certificates now. All right. Now, finally, with SMTP, does definitely have to be temporary because Microsoft is not going to support this, according to them, in future releases of the Windows operating system. So you're going to have to abandon this eventually anyway and figure something else out. So it's only a temporary solution at this point. All right, let's go ahead and take a look also at the global catalog, which is critical to the planning and implementation of your replication strategy, because the global catalog contains all forest objects. Now, if you just had a single domain, well, that's no big deal. You can make all your domain controllers global catalogs. And since it contains all forest objects and all domain controllers that are global catalogs, well, if there's a single domain, they already have everything they're going to have. But if you have multiple domains in your forest and all different kinds of child domains throughout this, and it gets really, really deep and complex, then each one of your global catalog servers has not only all the objects from its own domain, but all the objects from this domain, all the objects from this domain, all the objects from this domain, all the objects from this domain. And if you've got thousands and thousands of users and objects and all kinds of stuff throughout your child hierarchy here, that global catalog gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and wow, pretty soon it just goes through the roof. Wow, I'm not really quite sure why I'm laughing there. Folks, I've got a really bad head cold, and I'm taking all kinds of cold medicine, so it's like I'm on my own meth lab or something like that. Who knows if you can trust anything that comes out of my mouth right now. And with that level of assurance, let's move right along. So anyway, as I was mentioning, the global catalog contains all forest objects, but it doesn't contain all the attributes. It only contains what we call a partial attribute set. There are about 1,700 attributes in the schema, and the partial attribute set represents about 200 of the 1,700 attributes. Attributes. So just keep in mind, you don't need to memorize that number, but that gives you an idea there. And what it does is it helps you to identify the domain controller that an object was created in, keeps track of the group membership, such as the universal groups in particular. Universal groups and the membership of universal groups is stored in the global catalog. That's critical to the global catalog. Also, your applications, a lot of applications like Exchange, depend clearly upon the global catalog server to provide low query latency, because they query the global catalog regularly for a lot of different purposes. But Exchange server, message queuing, anything that uses DCOM is going to need the global catalog server to be easily available, normally in the same site as that server, whatever it is. Also, any queries that take place against a global catalog server take place on TCP port 3268, so make sure that you do have that open on your firewall for any global catalog queries that you expect to be made. So let's use a diagram here to kind of illustrate the problem with the global catalog that can occur. If we are all well connected, and if each one of these domains had its own site, just for simplicity's sake, as I mentioned in our last nugget, that's not always how it maps out. But let's just assume that each one of these domains has its own site as well, and they're all really well connected, high-speed WAN links, we don't have any problems with our utilization, well, probably everything would be fine. Remember, there's going to be global catalogs probably in each one of these different domains and sites that's going to collect all objects from all the other domains. But let's say that something else happens, and here in Arizona, wow, for some reason or other, in this site, we wound up with a really terrible WAN link. We got 128K WAN link. Well, now what happens is if the rest of this organization is highly active and there's thousands and tens of thousands of accounts that regularly change, like in a big university system or something like that, then every day I'm having to choke down to my global catalog server down here all changes through all domains throughout my entire forest. Wow. This little 128K WAN link is going to look like the snake that tried to swallow the elephant. It's just going to be a huge amount of replication traffic here. And guess what? That might not even be necessary. These poor folks down here, they may not have any universal group memberships that even matter throughout the rest of this forest, so this big global catalog may have very little usefulness to us. Now, a couple of alternatives that we can use if we got this kind of problem. One of the things we could do, I think I mentioned this in our last nugget, is I could break this off completely and make it its own forest. Okay, and if I do that so that it's its own forest, remember the global catalog contains all attributes, all objects rather, in its own forest. Well, if it's only one domain and in this one forest, there's not that much to contain there. Okay, so that's one thing I could do. The other thing I might do is I might have to set up something else called a universal group membership caching, which we usually abbreviate like that. Now, before we move along and talk about something called universal group membership caching, let's first of all review how you configure whether or not your server is a global catalog. Here I just go to the Active Directory sites and services, and you can see that I'm underneath a site here under servers, and then underneath the server itself I go to NTDS settings, and then I go to its properties with a right click, and that's where you say global catalog or not global catalog. Okay, that's where all of that's configured. Now, if you have a single domain, as I mentioned in a previous slide there, where we broke off that domain into its own forest, if we have a single domain in the forest, you might as well make all domain controllers global catalog servers because they have no additional replication burden than they already have. But if there is a multi-domain environment, then they have to have not only their own objects, but also all objects from every other domain in the forest. Now, in this example, let's take a look at how this can cause a problem as well. Here I've got nuggetlab.com up here in the Phoenix site, and here in Goldfield I've got mines.nuggetlab.com. Now you might wonder, what's Goldfield? Okay, I've got to take a brief detour here to tell you about this. Goldfield is down near a place called Apache Junction in the southeast part of Phoenix, distant southeast part, and there's some beautiful mountains there. In fact, here I took a picture of it last spring where we had some beautiful wildflowers here. There's actually gold mining operations that are taking place near this location, about behind me from this perspective, and a little bit to my to the north, I guess, is where it would be. But there's still some gold mining that goes on here. Maybe down here in the mines.nuggetlab.com location, they have some active mining going on, and we got 12 users, 2 groups, no universal groups, and 15 computers. Not that big of an operation for this whole domain. But up here in nuggetlab.com, look, 8,000 users, 450 groups, 40 of them universal, and 8,300 computers. Now what happens here is, if we're part of the same forest, my poor little global catalog server down here, it has to choke down all of this information every day. Every time there's changes to anything in any object in the global catalog, we have to choke it down. Well, that might be an awful lot to expect out of this 128K WAN link. But to make that more complicated, some of these users right here are actually members of these universal groups up here, and they have an ACL on this file share right up here. So I've got members from Phoenix and Goldfield in a universal group on this ACL. So because of that, these users, when they log on, they need a global catalog server to confirm their universal group membership. Okay, because without that, they might not be able to access the resources. Now, if this WAN link went down, the users would still be able to log on, and they'd have cached credentials and stuff like that, and they would have their own domain controller here with a global catalog on it. But what if, and let me clear up some things here, what if we decided not to make this server a global catalog server? Because there was way too much WAN traffic going on across here. Well, if that were the case, then what we would have to do is we would have to use one of the global catalog servers up in this location to confirm each user's universal group membership. Okay, so we'd have to confirm this user's universal group membership in order for them to be able to access this resource. Unfortunately, we still don't really have a good solution, because now we've got to send global catalog traffic across this WAN link all the time, and we might have to open up that port I told you about as well, and maybe we don't really want that to happen. So what we can also do here is to set up universal group membership caching. The way that works is this domain controller down here can be set up for UGMC. And what will happen is it'll pull global catalog, or in particular, universal group information from this global catalog server up here, and it caches it down here on this domain controller. That way, when this user logs on to this domain controller, it will just check to see whether it's got the proper universal group membership. It'll just confirm that membership, and then we're good to go. It doesn't have to go across the WAN link to communicate with this global catalog server. The first time this user logs on, and it has a universal group membership, then it will have to go across the WAN link to check it one time. But once that's been checked, then it caches it with our universal group membership caching on this domain controller. And then what happens is, every 8 hours, this global catalog server, or rather this domain controller here, will confirm its cached membership with an actual global catalog, just to confirm that it's up to date. It can also cache up to 500 groups, so that's more than enough for offices like this. And it's going to always use the cache as long as we can confirm this user's membership in this cache. It'll always use the cache even if this global catalog server is actually available. Now, there are also some things to think about with this. You can't use universal group membership caching in every instance. For example, if we had an Exchange server down here, it's unfortunate, but we'd probably just have to live with this really terrible WAN connection and have a global catalog server there. An alternative, just to think about, it's not exam worthy, but just to think about is, you can have all of these users down here, as long as they have internet access as well. Maybe they have a separate connection for a cable modem or something like that, and they've got an ISP, which gives them high-speed internet access. Then you could just have your Exchange server up here, and then just use Outlook Web Access. Okay, and then these users can just open up a web browser, and then get all their access through the internet to open up their web browser to check their email. So that's another option there that we would not have to have then a global catalog server down here. Also, this is going to work best for smaller environments. Usually, if it's going to be less than 100 users, just kind of as a rule of thumb, not hard and fast, but that's generally how we consider that. And if we don't have a large number of roaming users. So if you had a lot of traffic where people up here in Phoenix were visiting Goldfield all the time, and you had all kinds of people coming down to visit this office, well then again, you'd probably have to have a global catalog server down here. But if that doesn't happen very often, you don't really have a lot of roaming users, then again, universal group membership caching might come into play. So let me summarize that. When could we use universal group membership caching? Number one, when we don't have application servers down here that depend on a global catalog, like Exchange. When we have a smaller number of users. And if we have a pretty poor WAN link here and we don't want to replicate all the global catalog traffic across it. And then finally, again, of course, when we don't have a lot of roaming users from this other office coming down here. And I thought rather than just describe that, I'd also put it in a whiteboard here for you just to summarize that. A global catalog, you're going to need that if you have the applications that need it, greater than 100 users, and you have roaming users. Universal membership caching, universal group membership caching, no global catalog apps like Exchange, less than 100 users, no roaming or very little roaming, and an unavailable WAN at times or a poor WAN connection. That's the case in which you might want to use universal group membership caching. Alright, so now you're probably thinking, okay, great, James, this universal group membership caching sounds wonderful. How do we turn it on? Well, notice that we have here NTDS settings. Remember, that's where we configure global catalogs. Here we have the actual site itself. Now, there's something that's a little confusing about this. Here, this looks exactly like this. NTDS settings, NTDS site settings. That's a little bit different. Here's where you're going to right-click and choose Properties to enable universal group membership caching. And then when you decide that you want to refresh the cache from a specific location, it'll pick out the global catalog server in whichever other site you're looking at here. I guess I'm in the Phoenix site, so I'd have to pick Tucson in this case. So that's what I would do. Now what'll happen is once I click OK, these domain controllers will have universal group membership caching enabled, and they will pull their universal groups out of Tucson. Okay, and again, that's only going to be cached for users that are actually logging on that have universal group membership. Now there's another exam objective that's called printer location tracking. Actually, it's called printer location policies. That relates to a group policy object you have to configure, but it relates actually to this capability. And what this allows us to do is to find shared printers in a specific location. I mean, if I'm in a smaller company, we have one building and like 2 printers in the print room. That's not that big a deal. I can find those just fine. But if I'm in a large enterprise-wide organization and I travel from office to office, and this week I have to go to Phoenix, and I need to find a printer near me, well, I could search for printers, but it could probably list dozens or even hundreds of printers, and I have no idea, just searching, which one's close to me. So what printer location tracking does is it helps you to find shared printers in a location-specific manner. What it does is it will pre-populate the search field in your printer location tracking with whatever is near you in your own subnet. So based upon your IP address, where it identifies which subnet you're in, it'll identify printers that are also in that location. And so that's the whole point of that. You enable this with entering in a location in the subnet itself and the properties of the subnet. In Active Directory sites and services, you can configure that. And then for the printer's properties, there's also a location field that you'll need to enter in. Both of these are Active Directory attributes that will then be entered in for the subnet and printer respectively. And then you'll enable the whole thing with a group policy object. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I've done here. I've already set this up, and I've got a printer that I've already installed. This is just my own, small office printer that maybe I want to share with other people. So what I did was, after I installed it, I go to its properties, and I've entered in this location. Actually, you can enter that in when you install it as well, but I entered that in, and I used kind of a naming convention that starts from the largest and works its way down to the smallest, as you can kind of see right here. you do need to come up with a naming convention that's consistent across your organization, and generally you do go from largest or continent to whatever region or whatever country, and then whatever state within the country or province, for example, and then perhaps a city. And if you wanted to go a little further, maybe you had a large building with multi-floors, you could go, floor 1 or something like that. Whatever would make sense for your organization. One thing you also must be sure you do is that even if you share it, by default it will not choose to also list in the directory. And that was empty when I first shared this. So you need to make sure that you change the sharing options as an administrator and make sure you check that box, which you can see I've done now, but it wasn't done that way by default. After that's been done, the other thing I need to do is to also configure my subnet. So this is the subnet that printer actually appears on. And if I go into the properties of that subnet, you'll see that on the location tab, I need to match that location to what the printer also said for its location. So once that's been entered in properly, and be careful of typos and the like, then we're done with that. The final thing that we need to do is to go to a group policy object, and you can see I've just printed in the printer location here, kind of in a general location for the whole domain. But you could do this on a OU for a specific building where the printers are located, or you could do it wherever you need to. The printer location policy, though, is probably okay in some cases on a domain-wide basis because it's not very specific in terms of which location. Let me show you what I mean. All this does is it really just turns on the ability for your clients that receive this policy to search for printers based on location. It will pre-populate in the search field the location that we looked at, the NA/US AZ Phoenix. So we'll go into administrative templates and printers, and then if we look at this item right here, pre-populate printer search location text, all I have to do is enabled. You don't do the NA, US, AZ, whatever that stuff is. You just enable this policy. Once then it's been refreshed on all of the client computers, and they've read that policy, then they should be able to locate a printer. For example, here I've got another computer here. Okay, and this particular computer also has a printer installed. Let me go to this one. DC Nugget 4 is in a different subnet, however. Okay, and all I'm doing is showing you that it is in a different subnet. There is already installed and readily available for people to use. Now, the thing is, that's not the one we actually want if we're in the Phoenix office for NuggetLab.com. Now here I've got a DC Nugget 2 computer. This computer also happens to be a domain controller, but it would work for workstation clients or domain controllers, either one. And I want to add a printer. But the thing is, I don't want to add that printer from DC Nugget 4, which is in some other city, like in Tucson or something. I want to add a printer that's near me in the same location. So there's a printer right there, and I can see that is in the correct location. So that could work right there. But if you don't see the printer you want listed, then click that item down at the bottom. And here I want to find a printer based on location. Okay, and then I'll click on Next. Notice that now what it does is it automatically pre-fills this item for me. Since it knows what subnet I'm in based on my IP address, and since the subnet properties have this location in them, then it's going to help me to search against that location only. Now, only printers that have this same location in them will actually pop up. So if I choose Find Now, we'll see that it does indeed show that one printer, and then I could, install it, and that would pretty much be it. Now I double-click on it to install it. Hopefully I've got drivers over there. And then I'll go ahead and install the driver as it asks. And that's pretty much it. Now I'll have that printer installed for this client. Alright, so now you can see that printer did indeed install here. Now just as a quick note here, by the way, if you did really want to print to a printer, elsewhere, if you're in the Phoenix office and you really did want to print to one in Tucson, even though you're sitting at a Phoenix desktop, you could do that, provided, of course, you had good network connectivity and things. And it might be kind of a substitute for faxing a document to somebody. You could just send it to the printer in Tucson instead. So I could, again, double-click on this to add a printer, and I could go to search by location. And then here, instead of Phoenix, I would enter in Tucson. But notice what happens. Even though it says search against the entire directory, when I click Find Now, it doesn't show me anything. This is one thing that's a little bit twitchy about this. This should encompass both NuggetLab and west.nuggetlab.com when you select entire directory. Nevertheless, the Tucson site has domain controller of west.nuggetlab.com, so I actually have to select that manually and click Find Now before that printer that's down in Tucson will appear. And then when I click OK, it'll install the drivers. Okay, Oh, sorry, I feel a little sniffle coming on. Time to take some more cold medicine. Oh, well, I'll do that later. Okay, let's go ahead and conclude, first of all, here with what we learned. Okay, we had information that we learned about was the global catalog, the universal group membership caching, and printer location. First of all, the global catalog servers. Remember, those fulfill a very important and vital role, but you can't always afford to have one depending upon your network traffic and the amount of replication that might be needed. So you may have to instead use universal group membership caching, provided you can meet the requirements that I talked to you about on the global catalog versus UGMC whiteboard that we showed earlier. Remember, this is a great way to cache your universal groups so that you don't have to query against a global catalog, and that way you can also avoid having a global catalog in a site and having all of its associated replication traffic. We also talked about printer location policy, which is a great way to find printers that are actually near somebody in their same subnet. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.